This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
When Austrian philosopher Ivan Illich was asked about the most revolutionary way to change society, he answered, "Neither revolution nor reformation can ultimately change a society. Rather, you must tell a new, powerful story, one so persuasive that it sweeps away the old myths and becomes the preferred story, one so inclusive that it gathers all the bits of our past and our present into a coherent whole, one that even shines some light into our future so that we can take the next step. If you want to change society," he says, "then you have to tell an alternate story." As Christians, we've been given the greatest story ever told and been invited to be a part of it. But is that how we view, read and apply our reading of the Bible? What difference then does it make to understand the Christian faith and the Bible as a story? Reading the Bible as a grand narrative or story rather than merely a system of theological ideas and values is crucial for understanding its overarching message and the continuity of God's plan throughout history. Now join Connell Mann and myself as we jump into this conversation, the Bible as a story. Matt, when we use the word stories, as we talk through the story of Christian faith and the Bible as a story as our topic, for me it conjures up the sense of it's just another story, and we hear story used in a very kind of broad sense these days. Oh, that movie, it has such a great storyline.
Oh, yeah.
I guess my concern is that listeners might be thinking that we're thinking just, find
like
a story, a story you like and attach to that, and that'll be your reality in a sense.
Yeah, okay, story. Look, we could use the word narrative,
yes,
but that feels a bit dry and sort of technical.
Yeah,
so, I mean, we understand stories, like we tell stories about our lives. People share stories. I mean, we do it in our church. We have times where people share their stories.
But again, I'm involved in a funeral on Friday, and someone gets up to say, "Oh, I need to tell you this great story about," and you're kind of half wondering, is it a true story or is it just a story? So I think there's a importance for us just to, as we build this whole series around this, is just to really understand what we mean when we use the term story. It's really a worldview, isn't it? Is that kind of the...
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's the Bible presents an overarching story. But I mean, this is the thing with a story. If I say I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened to me. Now, there were lots of other things going on. Let's say I take a segment of my life and I'm going to tell you a story. My story of going to boarding school, for example. Right? And I tell you a story. Now, I'm naturally going to select a sort of a thread out of that, aren't I?
Yes.
Because,
we haven't got that long.
Like every day, countless events happened,
yes,
right?
Yes.
So I have to select events of particular significance that convey the thing that I want to convey. So I think this is where the notion of story is a good one, because you think of all of the events that have ever happened in the world, and what the Bible is doing is it's drawing a strand of things that God did in people's lives, not the only things that God ever did in people's lives. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that you have the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Israel, and then you have this story of this guy Job.
Yes.
Where does he even live? And God has this interaction with this godly man that, is not really part of the main story. And it's a hint, I think, that God is dealing with other people, but there's a central significance in the story that begins with Abraham and then through Israel. There's something that happens there that's important for everyone, and that says something particular about God
for everyone.
To everyone. Yeah. So in the same way as I might tell you a story about my, boarding school experience, I will choose a strand out of there of what I think is significant. Essentially, that's probably why we talk about the Bible telling a story, because it's not the history of the world.
No, that's right.
That's right. I mean, look, this is the other interesting thing with history, and we'll get onto this when we do the next episode on Christian history, because what counts as what actually counts as the Christian story?
Yeah.
and because historians tend to gravitate towards certain things, but that may not be what is theologically most significant.
I mean, when we talk about story too, it's not unique. Like, we're not saying this is unique to Christianity. The story is the actual story, but having a story.
Oh, as in having a story, not unique.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah. So,
because the story itself is unique.
Yeah.
But like we said in the last episode, everyone tells a story. Everyone selects data out of, the sort of, I mean, it's almost the endless range of data and events and things that we could draw from. I mean, scientists do this. They grab a slab of reality and they choose to focus on that.
Yeah. And Connell,
sociologists do that, or psychologists. I mean, every field of knowledge is essentially taking a slab out of reality, blocking out some things and seeing patterns.
Yeah. And Connell, you said, which I thought was a great analogy of this in the last episode, around statistics. The statistics are all there and they're all correct, but you can take a particular bit of statistics and it'll tell a certain story and make it tell the story you want it to tell.
So what story you tell out of that? I mean, it's a little bit like, you have those puzzles where you have a big grid of letters, just all different letters, and you're meant to find the words, in there. And so, it's drawing out the particular pattern of significance. And I guess, we're confronted with all of this experience, in life, and we naturally have to be selective on what we focus on, what we think is particularly significant. Historians do that in retrospect when they take all of the information of history. Of course, they're limited by what information they have available to them, and they tell a story. So everyone tells stories. They choose to focus on different things, and they tell a story about what they believe is most significant.
I think any good writing is really there to tell a story. I mean, that's the most engaging content to consume, is when there is a story. Even with dry topics, good writers bring an angle out of it. Even if it's quite technical content, and you can kind of construct it in a way that tells a story, because I think it's easier to grapple with complicated ideas in a similar way, like the way that we use things like analogies and things like that. With a story, I guess you're able to take quite complicated ideas. If it was a legal document is absence of any story. In fact, you're trying to eliminate any sense of a story from it, because you need really strict ideas that constrain, this is this and this is this and this is what's going to happen. It's getting rid of ambiguity. It's just sort of nailing the facts. So they're really, really clear, where I feel like stories gradually reveal something to you. It's not
good point.
You don't sort of read, point 1, point 2, point 3, and each those
independent of each other.
Those facts tell you everything you need to know.
Yeah.
That's what a legal document tries to do. But pretty much all other writing involving anything that's quite technical, you're still trying to make it interesting. What's my angle on this?
But I think also we interpret our lives based on our experiences, which are stories of our lives. I mean, we don't analyze my life at the end of the day going, well, did I, as you said, working through some kind of legal it's like, I think about what happened to me today and how that fits into the story of my life. And
that's I just come back to what you said, Connell. I think that difference is a really important difference, because the Bible doesn't come to us as just lists of commands, or a little bit like the Quran, if read.
There's a story in the Quran. Like, it tells the story of Muhammad
not really. I mean, it actually is allegedly the revelation that he received, but it's largely just lists and lists and lists of sort of commands. And it's interesting also to note that the Bible, in relation to that illustration that you used just then, the difference between, say, a legal document and a story, the difference between two kinds of explanations of a thing. I can explain something through just sort of an abstract, list of facts or propositions, which is perhaps like if you read a systematic theology, for example, and a systematic theology asks fairly abstract questions and then answers those questions. But the Bible answers the key questions of human existence. Who is God? Who are we? What is our purpose? It answers that by telling us a story. And that's a different kind of explanation. Now, it's not a form of explanation that's unknown to us, because the competing explanations, so for example, the sort of naturalistic explanation is also based on a story. This is how everything came about. And so therefore this is who we are, right? So the naturalistic explanations also rest on stories that are also very selective in the data that they draw from, that they feel is significance. There's always there's an element of judgment, interpretation there, because again, there's lots of data, but what do we choose and how do we pattern? It's like a dot to dot drawing. When we draw the lines between the dots, we all have access to the same dots, the same experience, but we can draw different pictures, different stories from that. So story as an explanation is actually one that was common in the ancient world. It tended to be the way that they answered the key questions. They would tell stories. Now, we refer to these now as myths. And a lot of those stories do contain what we think of when we think of myths. We think of something really bizarre, fanciful, something obviously, untrue. The gods got fighting and one god got split in two and one half became the land and one half the sky, or, really quite bizarre stories of the gods and whatever in the ancient Near East. It's often been noted that the Bible is very much not like one of those stories. That's actually, in many ways, very much contrasts that kind of storytelling. It still tells a story, because telling a story as an explanation really was the way to go.
Well, it still is. I would suggest that all of human life is told, shared, and interpreted through story. I mean, we could say the media. I mean, it's interesting to me that social media uses the term stories, because it's actually painting a picture of what life is for you.
Yeah.
So I think, it's safe to say that that's how we've always understood and interpreted our lives, is through story.
Yeah. And so, Genesis chapter 1, it tells us a story about how God created the universe that is creating patterns and all sorts of things. And it doesn't have all of the bizarre sort of elements that you see. It's very condensed. And of course, we're looking at this in our sister podcast and Thrive Deeper. And we did a whole episode just on Genesis chapter 1.
And I really encourage listeners to go and take a listen to that, Thrive Deeper. You'll find it in your podcast app, because it really does cover, a lot of this understanding the patterns, as you just said, that we see in right from the start in the Bible, within Genesis.
That's right. And then you have Genesis chapter 2, and it tells... It's interesting because it tells the same story, but in a different way.
Yeah.
And it's even the events are slightly differently ordered. It's a very interesting the way that it tells two stories, and they're not incompatible, but it shows you how much, by focusing on some things and focusing out from other things, how different stories can actually be, because these two stories are wanting to do things from different aspects and highlight different things. And so they're compatible, but they're different.
Yes.
And we see the same thing in the Gospels, don't we? We see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they tell stories about Jesus. And there's a contrast between them because they're selective in what they're choosing. They order things in slightly different ways.
And not because one's right or one's wrong, but because they're trying to do something. I think that was a really good point you just made before with the particular text. With what they're telling, they're speaking to a particular audience, they're trying to highlight a certain thing. And it's the same as us when we share a story. If I'm wanting to highlight this aspect, I'll tell the same story in a slightly different way because I'm speaking into a particular situation.
Yeah, that's right. So, if you ask me the story of my boarding school experience that focused on, I don't know, how I learned music, right? I might condense out of that story.
Yeah, right.
I might tell you a whole lot of stories about forming a band and doing this and doing that. And it might be that I sort of cluster all those together as though it all happened in 1 week, when actually it all happened over 5 years or something like that,
And yet if we asked you about your boarding school experience with your spiritual formation, it would be a completely different story.
Yeah.
But not untrue.
That's right.
Because
and not incompatible.
And not incompatible,
I think this is all important because whilst the Bible is telling a story, it's got a different set of priorities and a different agenda to what, not always it's comparable to what historians, for example, do when they tell the story of Napoleon or the Napoleonic Wars or something like that. But even there, they have to choose what's significant, and it is driven somewhat by the values of the historian. I mean, in historiography, there's this sort of debate around from whose perspective do we tell the story? You know, what about the Indigenous people in Australia, and what about telling the story from their perspective? And so, this whole thing about decolonizing history is a big, thing in universities today. And so, this is a debate about how we tell stories and what we highlight as being significant. So,
It's a good point.
History isn't just a completely objective subject. Far from it.
So none of these stories are neutral. They're all designed to.
That's right. There are no neutral stories.
A personal bias from the author, or the author's wanting to highlight different sort of facts. So when I was sort of reading about, what is it that makes ancient writings different, and actually, it's not really different. Maybe it was more commonplace or more sort of obvious that the way that they wrote. We tend to think today, we kind of expect that when we're reading something, it is just a statement of facts. If we read something in the newspaper and the reporter's communicating something, all they're doing is just conveying some facts to us. So we're not really aware of it, but really the reporter's got a bias. They're trying to make a story out of something, and they might bring in other things that have happened to help sort of amplify the points that they're trying to make. But when I was looking at it from a historical context, you might tell the story from the aspect of a particular character, because you want to draw out how that character interacted in that story. The point was to teach you something through the character of that person. Yeah. Or it might be to tell you the story of how the culture and the context that they were living in functioned. Or it might be to tell the story of what led to that story and series of events. I still think that's how we write today. We're a little more sort of like rigid in our expectations. But I think today we just like to consume facts. But I see it.
I wonder if science has had a part in that.
Said, there are no facts, only interpretations.
Yeah.
I mean, there what we call just the facts are our selection of little points of a whole lot of data that we shape into a pattern that is essentially telling a story.
But isn't that
is based on our?
But isn't that the problem? Is that when we approach anything,
our view,
we have this expectation that everything's just a whole list of facts that we have to somehow consume.
And I would add to that, I think, in the modern age, because of where science has gone, we're not as comfortable with the we don't know paradigm, which they would have been more comfortable with. It's like we don't have any explanation of where God came from, just that he created the universe. In today's age, and the first question is, well, so who created God? The whole growth of the scientific approach to everything is, well, there has to be proof and evidence for everything. There have to be facts around everything. So we can't just go, well, we don't know the answer to that right now. And so then we actually even make up answers. Well, probably this is what happened. And that becomes the story that we then base the rest of our interpretation on, you know.
And like an example of it is like in the Gospels. You've basically got 4 eyewitness accounts of essentially the same events. And there are potentially conflicting statements made between them all that we've had to wrestle with. And in our sort of fact-based mindset, we go, oh, okay, what's the true set of facts here?
Which didn't bother them, by the way, because John knew of Matthew. Yeah. Like they knew of each other. So they didn't think it was incompatible.
No.
For them, it wasn't contradictions. For them, it's just looking at something from a different angle. I mean, if you and I look at any object from you over there and me over here, we're going to form accounts which potentially our description is going to feel contradictory because of perspective.
But it's not necessarily accidental, it's intentional.
Yeah, that's right.
Is one of the things I've kind of been looking at, is it's quite deliberate.
Absolutely intentional.
Because between all the 4 gospel writers, Matthew tends to emphasize more of Jesus as being the Messiah, the
Jewish Messiah,
Messiah descendant from David. Mark presents Jesus more as the one who comes and suffers. So it's emphasizing the suffering. Luke presents Jesus then as the savior to the world. And then John talks more about Jesus being more of that idea of the Logos, the Word of God coming and, flesh
more
here
of the deity
on
of Christ, essentially.
So they're all telling the same thing, but telling it from 4 different angles. And that's why we have If they're all saying the same thing, we don't need 4. But they're all talking about the same event, but looking at the story of Jesus from 4 different lenses that are all really important. So given that you're trying to emphasize different things, then when you go back to historical writing, they would actually change the order of things because they weren't necessarily presenting a strict chronological time frame that this happened and this happened and this happened. They will either leave things out or emphasize a different component. The timeline isn't so important, but there was something in that timeline that they wanted to elevate.
The sequence is interpretive, in the way that they order the events. They want the sequence to be part of the message. The sequence itself that they choose is interpreting something of the significance.
And it's deliberate. It's deliberate because they want
they're trying to do.
To elevate that.
Yeah.
It's the same as Kings and Chronicles. Kings and Chronicles tell the same story. Chronicles focuses only on the southern kingdom of Judah. It's sort of the northern kingdom is in the background, whereas Kings tells the stories of both the kings of Israel and Judah. And it's interesting in that story. You've got, say, the story of Manasseh, king of Judah. Manasseh's the son of the famous Hezekiah, and the story of Kings is, he's the bad guy. He's the one that pretty much was the point of no return, and that his rule led to the exile, right? So he's just the bad guy, right? But when you get to Chronicles tells the story of this amazing turnaround, this amazing sort of conversion experience, if we can call it that he had, right? Which you think, hang on a minute, why would the writer of Kings, isn't that the most important thing, right? But not for the book, not for Kings, because he's telling a story and he's explaining, essentially the writer of Kings explaining how they ended up in exile. The writer of Chronicles is living after the exile. And the question is more, is God still with us?
Yeah.
Like after we've sinned and really failed, is God still with us? And so he tells these stories that convey these turnaround experiences, because again, it's drawing on things that really happened, right? But it's being selective in the bits that you choose. Everyone does that.
Yeah.
To get back to a completely different sort of example, in a lot of contemporary philosophy that's looking at, the big picture of the why and why are we here kind of big questions, and the objections to the sort of materialist idea that everything is just material reality. The complaint there is from a number of contemporary philosophers like Thomas Nagel and Philip Goff and others is you're being so selective, right? There's a whole lot of data that you just have to push aside to make your story work, right? And, they're saying, no, you need to take this, consciousness, for example. And then the fact that there are many evidences that really show that it doesn't just look like chance events, because, the same sort of phenomena have evolved. It looks like everything.
Pattern.
If you take, and they're working with an evolutionary structure, their argument is, well, everything seems to be moving towards higher intelligence, right? So this all feels kind of rigged. And so, they're trying to take more of the data into consideration. So essentially, telling of stories, and this connects back with the last episode, all versions of reality, all accounts of reality, that they tell stories essentially, and everyone's belief system is based in what they think the story of reality is, or what they select as being significant.
And really, most of those sort of stories answer probably 3 primary questions. Why am I here? What's the purpose of my life? And why is the world so broken? Those are probably the 3
That's
big
the
questions.
key. Yeah, that's the key one. And so, the Bible is given to us as a story. It's very selective in what, and I think this is really useful for understanding the nature of a story, right? A story is essentially, and again, just to come back to this illustration, because I think this is useful. Let's say like a page, think of a page, and on that page is just covered in dots, right? Now, I'm going to draw a picture by linking one dot to another, but I'm going to be very select. Let's say I draw a picture of a face, very simple. Page is covered in dots, but I'm going to draw a face by linking certain of those dots, which means that I'm going to leave others aside and I'm going to choose some.
So you're going to be selective of the facts, Matt.
I am, but everyone is. This is the thing.
Yes.
I mean,
right.
We're constantly bombarded with all of this sense data, as well as conceptual material. I mean, and so we're always selecting. This is now generally accepted,
Yes.
right? In philosophy, in terms of how we construct our view of reality. We are absolutely always selective. So what the Bible
But isn't that such a negative, though? It's a negative term.
How is that negative?
To say to someone, oh, you're just being selective of the facts. You're selecting the facts to suit your agenda.
But everyone is.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, exactly.
I know,
right,
but here we are in modern society. We think we're not being selective of the facts. When we expect, when we're confronted with information, we think that it's all just a list of facts and the facts speak for themselves. And I think this is why this is important, this topic, because it's a beginning of self-awareness, I think, is the fact that every single one of us is selective of the facts, and everything that gets written is selective of the facts, and it's all there to suit some kind of bias of gender, or to tell a story, or to emphasize some character, to point to who the villain is, to identify a solution, to explain how we got into this mess. It's all to emphasize some point. And until we get to that level of self-awareness, we're always going to have this problem that whenever we look at anything, the Bible or God, for example, we're going to try to reduce it down to a set of facts.
Yeah.
So we look at the Bible and go, let's look at it as just a list of facts. If I was reading a historical document, it's just a collection of facts that were explain something that happened, and it's not.
That's right. It's not. It's certainly not an arbitrary, as though is everything just fell like that, or as you're saying, it's not just that.
It's there to tell something.
It's a selection.
And it's more than just the facts. You're saying the analogy used there is when you go through and you connect the dots to paint, to bring out a picture of a face.
Well, I think
the face is more than the dots, though. It's like all of a sudden there's a face now. There's like a piece of art that you've created by connecting the dots. So the face that emerges is so much more than just the dots. But I think as a society, as a modern culture, as we reduce everything down to just the dots, we're missing the face that's emerging. And this is what I see. Exactly. I feel so dumb having read the Bible for so many years through that lens, is reading it as a set of, I'd say stories, but as if it's just relaying statements, things that I just have to understand. This is who God is. This is what he wants me to do. This is what happens if I don't do it, But now that I kind of look at it and understand this a little bit better, I kind of see that that's not what's going on at all. I can't reduce God down to a set of bullet points. Even if I was to say, well, what is the problem? Like if we were to say, talk about sin, I can't define sin just as in, well, sin is if you do this, 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 and this, and maybe there's a list of 100 things, and if you're not on that list of 100 things, you've never sinned. I can't reduce it down to that. Sin is a breakdown in relationship with God, and the story provides examples of what relationship breakdown with God.
It explains what it is through. Yeah, that's right.
Without being so prescriptive, without a whole list of facts. So through the story, I start to learn about what that breakdown in relationship with God looks like, so that I start to recognize sin in my own life, even though the sin that's in my life may not be listed in the Bible, but there is rebellion that I have towards God, or times that I don't listen to him, or times that I just go my own way or suit my, all of those. I recognize that, and I do it by recognizing those patterns within the characters in the Bible. So the explanatory power of stories just transcends all of the facts. I think a lot of it links back to, you remember we were talking about, the work of Ian McGilchrist and the idea of the understanding, the intuitive knowledge that we need to reharness. And to me, that's the power of the stories, is that by reading the stories and absorbing the characters and the way that people interacted, I'm developing an intuitive way of how I react and how other people react, and then an intuition of the problem, because it's actually too hard to reduce everything down to a collection of statements.
You'd have to make too many.
Well, reality. This is the thing: is that reality? It's not the nature of reality. Reality is a process, an unfolding, isn't it? It's everything's in flux and moving, right? So, it makes sense to understand the nature of that movement and to understand where it's come from and where it's going. And that's essentially what the Bible does. It just doesn't just give us a static, abstract facts about reality. Now, we can draw certain beliefs and tenets of faith and certain things that we can say about God that we learn from that story. So we can abstract out of that story. And the Bible does that in New Testament letters, and for example, and things are said about who we are and about who God is. But that emerges from a story.
If we look at the way that story is constructed, just to come back to the Bible as a story, there's the common term, the 4-chapter gospel, which talks about creation, which explains the way things were, the fall, which explains the way things are, redemption, which shows the way things could be, and then restoration or recreation, however you want to language that, which shows the way things will be. And and that's what the story is really telling.
That's the arc of the story. And so I think in what we've said so far, some really good principles that I think can help us understand the nature of what we're dealing with. So take the, creation story that we've just talked about. I believe, Genesis 1, Genesis 2 to 4, or Adam and Eve and the fall, and I believe all of that's grounded in facts. Mm-hmm. But it's not the only facts that pertain. There are lots of other things. You know what I mean? Like I believe, I believe that God, that God declared that this is in some sense that it's unfathomable to us, and that when God willed that thing, that it came about, right? Mm-hmm. And that God, separated this from that and named that, mm-hmm. and all of that. Now, there could have been, and probably was, infinite other, not infinite, but we're dealing with a finite universe. So an innumerable range of other facts going on at that time, right? But what Genesis 1 does is it draws out, it's like, imagine one of those beaches with all of these stones on the beach. And you just got a sea of rocks, right? And what it does is like, I'm going to paint this rock, and then I'm going to paint that rock, and I'm going to form a pattern, right? Or even in a sense, it's not just saying that as though every fact is equally important. It's actually pointing out, it's maybe as though in the midst of that are these nuggets of gold or something, that's like, this is actually, this is the pivotal thing. This is the pivotal thing. So story of Adam and Eve and in the garden, and, who knows what else was going on at that time and how many other elements there were to that story. But what the writer is doing is condensing down, is choosing this fact, that fact, that fact, and drawing a pattern to convey a message. So we've said so far that everyone does this. This is naturally what human beings do, right? We look at the stars and we link stars up, and we that looks like a bull or whatever, right? We're pattern finding creatures. We naturally find patterns. And so we all interpret this and because we've been fragmented and alienated from God, we tend to interpret reality in ways that serve our purposes, right? So there's an element of will here. It tends to be what we want to believe. So the question is, how do we know what actually is the most significant story? The scientific story, even the naturalistic scientific story, they're telling the truth in the sense that their facts are facts, but they're not the only facts. Mm-hmm. As I've said, they have to push aside a whole lot of other facts. In a sense, it's our values that determine what we regard as being the most important elements there and what we ignore. And so it comes down to something fairly subjective, comes down to, what is most important to us. But, when we ask the question, what is actually fundamentally the most important thing, right? Not just subjectively to you or me. That is what we call, and I'm going to use a big word here, truth. That's what we call truth. Truth isn't just the fact, truth is just the facts. No. Truth is the selection of the most significant facts, essentially. Yeah. To tell the truth is to bring what is most significant to the surface. It's, in a sense, to order things by the right kind of values. Essentially and this is the beauty, Stu, this is the beauty of Genesis chapter 1, is that it's like a sieve let's say you lose these nuggets of gold on a beach, right? And you're sieving out the sand to find these nuggets. This is essentially what Genesis is doing. Is it's like a sieve, and it's letting all the other facts, and there's so many other things that could have been going on, but it's letting all of that go through the sieve, and it's the big nuggets that remain, right? It's this, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and it's actually ordering those facts in a way that's theologically significant, like the Gospels do, because Genesis chapter 2 is going to give us a slightly different order. And so I think it's a great way of understanding and it's a great way of recognizing the way in which the Bible tells us the truth is by bringing out those single nuggets. Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3 and like the fall. Where did things go wrong, right? I mean, a whole lot of things went wrong.
Yes.
Things have been going wrong everywhere, but where does it start? And it tells us this story that, again, are these big rocks. It lets all of the details fall away. It tells us in very big condensed terms. And in some ways, this is why it's sometimes gets criticized, right? Because it's so minimalistic. The serpent comes into the garden and the fruit, and there's the two people, and people say, "Oh, it sounds like a kid story."
Yeah.
But that is,
exactly.
That's the nature of letting that many facts fall away and focusing just on a few big
But I think
things.
that highlights a problem for us as Christians, because I think too often we try to defend the Bible using the world's notion of the facts.
Yeah.
We even when we see something happen that seems to, we draw the dots to that. You see this in all the Revelation stuff online. And it's like trying to prove, see, the Bible's right because this is happening and this is happening and this is happening, which it could be, but we try to use the world's notion of the facts and apply that to prove the Bible is...
But we do it almost with like Genesis 1. Like you said, I see the truth is more than just the statement of those facts. So it's like when God created when it's described in the creation story, God spoke it and it happened. Now, you could just take that as a fact in its own right and say, well, what did he actually use his voice? Like, what is God's voice? How would God's voice make this happen? But that's not the point. The point isn't that he uttered words. Like when it talks about him speaking, he's making a conscious decision to bring it into existence. He decided, he called it into existence. So it's not necessarily being prescriptive about the scientific facts to say this is what he did, necessarily day one, day two, but then people get hung up, the light couldn't have come before the sun and all this sort of stuff. So therefore, that's not the point. The point is a purpose behind. The sequence isn't necessarily chronologically from a scientific perspective, but it's necessary from a theological perspective.
But I think we've also got to be careful not to discount what are the important rocks by saying scientifically that, because I would say if someone was to say, well, it's not possible for there to be light because the sun wasn't created to here, so therefore it's just not.
Yeah, but whose story says that?
And more the point, that then says something about who you think God is. Essentially, you're saying, well, God couldn't have done that until he created the sun. Well, hang on, here's someone who just spoke something into existence and you're saying he couldn't have light until he'd made a ball in the sky. I mean, I think we've got to be careful not to go the other way.
I think in response to you, Connor, I think we can say it doesn't have to be chronological because we know that the Bible tells true stories in a way that aren't necessarily chronological, right?
Yes.
We know that happens and it still very much recognizes absolutely being the truth, right? So it doesn't have to be, but we need to be careful about pronouncing that can't be chronological because science says it can't be. Because I think Genesis 1 could be. Absolutely could be. But as long as we understand that saying that it's the truth is not saying that that's all there was going on. It's not all the facts. It's because remember, truth is the right selection of facts. It's choosing what truly is actually the most significant. So let's just move forward, right? Of all of the insignificant, in inverted commas, people in the ancient Near East in sort of 1800 BC, I mean, let's go back to the ancient world and all of the people. Here's this nomad, this from Ur of the Chaldees, that is is sort of wandering around, this guy called Abram.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, completely. So that becomes a crucial rock. right? He becomes, this is the beautiful thing. And it chooses these other rocks, Hagar. The text gives a slave girl, which never, ever happens in ancient Near Eastern literature, gives a slave girl a voice, talks about how God answers. I mean, there's so much attention and care is given to her, promise is made to her. It's just like, that so is like remarkable.
Turning everything upside down.
Yeah,
it's
that's
like
right.
What you would expect isn't what happens.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Matthew in his gospel, you mentioned the gospels, right? He's obviously being selective, right? He wants the genealogy of Christ to be the number of people be divisible by 7, right? So he's being theologically selective already. But he's also selective. So he's left some people out, but he's also selective in who he puts in, because he puts in 4 women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. And there's some sort of questionable reputations, all for different reasons. And he's putting this in there because that for him is theologically significant, because the gist of the story is not about heroic people who deserve acclaim, but it's sinful or people outside who receive grace.
Yeah.
That's the big rocks. And so this is, so this is why it's Abraham, and then, you've got 2 brothers, and then, and then it's Isaac, and then Jacob, and then it's Moses, and it's the people of Israel. I mean, of all the people in the world, we're going to choose a bunch of slaves. And so it's always going to tell this story in a way that focuses. There's a lot of things going on, but it's going to put a massive magnifying glass. And it's going to do this selectively as well. So it's going to tell the story, and then it's going to magnify one moment and one event, and then it's going to go back to, so it's almost like, microscope. You've got the thing that can go in and out, and it sort of does this, and it makes it look sometimes 400 years. It'll cover in a line.
Yeah.
And then it'll be chapters and chapters of something that happened in one day.
Yes. Yeah. But you see, that genealogy, at one level, it's a collection of facts, and you tend to read it and you just skip over it anyway because you don't want to read all the names. So it's just like a whole collection of facts. But actually, it's also, this is what I mean about the truth that it's trying to communicate is greater than just the facts themselves, because the point isn't just to keep an historical record of the genealogy. It's to, at one level, it could be to tie Jesus back to David, the Davidic roots of the Messiah. Another level, it communicates the line of Jesus is actually made up of broken people.
Yeah.
So there in the genealogy, it's not just a statement of all the names, it's in there, it's telling another truth. And it's not on its own, it's the truth that's elaborated and expanded in other parts of the Gospels and throughout the Bible. This is where it kind of really gets incredible. This is where the Bible stands alone as like an incredible piece of literature. It's not just a combination of books, but it's that unified message all the way through. And as you go in on the microscope, or you get your magnifying glass and zoom in, you can look at it and it communicates one set of truth that is also told at different layers through all of the other stories, right from the beginning right through to the end. And you can then sort of zoom out and then look at it a different way. And then there's another kind of truth that's revealed from the same set of words.
Well, a pattern emerges.
And it's not just one pattern. There's multiple levels, and it's just, you know.
Without, I mean, I think when you say that, because I think then it doesn't mean that you can read in whatever you want. And like I think we need to be careful, because things have gotten out of hand in history when people tried to allegorize the story. Yeah. No, I think the story, the story of David killing Goliath and the stone. I mean, we need to avoid the tendency to say, what does this stand for? What do the 5 stones stand for? Do they stand for the 5-fold ministry of Ephesians chapter?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, of course.
Well, that's actually 4-fold, but all sorts of bizarre interpretations would tend to allegorize the text. No, that actually the meaning is in the story as it actually says. You don't need to make another story about
to explain the story.
That's right. So I think we've got to be careful in doing that, because there is significance in the pattern that story says. One of the interesting things about the biblical narratives is that you get similar things that happen again and again and again. So, for example, Abraham, receives the promise of blessing from God, and this is in Genesis chapter 12. There's a famine in the land, and he goes down, into Egypt, and his wife is taken captive by Pharaoh, and a curse comes upon Pharaoh's house. This is like the story of Exodus, right? And it's there in Genesis chapter 12. It's a microcosm of the story of Exodus. The story of Joseph is tracking the trajectory of God's blessing and what this looked like for one particular person. So you get these stories about individuals, but they say something primarily about God and about how God's promises unfold, often despite the fallibility of people. I mean, the story of Jacob is a great example of a really, really bad guy, but God works his purpose through him. And he gradually realizes that and comes to the party.
Yeah.
And in a sense, the story of Jacob is the story of Israel, and it's also the story of humanity.
So that's what I mean. In the next episode, I think we might talk about things like prefiguring and so on, that theological ideas.
I'm just trying to rein you in there a bit,
I know.
Connell. I know you can be a bit wayward,
I know.
so I'm looking after you here.
We don't have to beep out too
We
much.
might have to edit this. And I guess it also brings us back to the other principle of like hermeneutics and understanding it in the context of the greater context, not bringing our own bias to it. We're not digging through these stories trying to find some other alternative hidden meaning that we can uncover to suit whatever it is that we're wanting to say. We're allowing these stories to speak the way that they were.
That's right.
So truths that are meant to come out.
Hermeneutics, just to explain that, is the art of interpretation, and a key aspect of interpreting the Bible rightly is interpreting the Bible by its own values, and not by our values and drawing out what we think is important. But and actually, those values in the Bible, because of the repetition, are very, very evident. And so this is the remarkable thing about these stories is the way that they're patterned. I've read this story so many times, and I've just, because we're in the Thrive Deeper podcast, we're working through Genesis, and I've been reading through Genesis again, and it's remarkable, the patterns that I'm seeing that are in the text. It's just that I'm seeing things that I didn't see before, because the thing about Bible interpretation is the more you know the big picture, the more you see the significance of the details. So, think about my drawing a face with all the dots, page full of dots, but I link a certain number of dots and draw a face. Once I see the face, I can go back and see the connection. And I think with the Bible, the more you see the big picture, the more you see how the little bits actually point to that big picture. And it's just remarkable. I mean, it is so remarkable. I just don't think it's humanly possible, the way that this came together. And this is why I think reading the Bible again and again as a story, I think one of the key reasons for this is because those patterns that we find are actually the patterns that are meant to be true of our lives. The very same patterns, because you could think, oh, well, what has the story of Abraham got to do with me? No, there's a pattern in the story of Abraham that is the pattern that God wants for your life.
Yeah.
And it's not that exactly what happened to Abraham is going to happen to you, but there are patterns to that story. It's the pattern of blessing. It's the way that the promise unfolds. And you see it again and again and again. You see it happening right throughout Scripture, but you see it from different angles. Someone in this situation, someone in that situation. You see these pattern of blessing and where it goes. And it's so assuring. It's so inspiring, because when I look at my life, I think, I see that. I am Jacob. There's so much in Jacob's story. It's completely different circumstances. I mean, Jacob's like a semi-nomadic clan leader, right? In the ancient world, completely different human being, but it's the same God and it's the same blessing. And what it enables me to do is look at my life, and then in the light of that story, when I look at my life with all that I think might be significant, or that fades away, and I see that pattern in my own life, and I begin to understand the significance of my own life.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.